Tushar Garg has raised over $200 million for his company, Flyhomes. When he raised his first round, it happened in less than 30 minutes. But the next round, a totally different story. He was starting his raise right when his co-founder got hit by a drunk driver, was severely injured, in the hospital, and out for a year. That raise was a lot harder. I'm Ben Elowitz. I've worked with outstanding founders for years, and I've been interviewing them for months here on this podcast, Razor's Edge. I got to tell you, it feels like every founder I talk with who has been a top raiser has had to deal with these kinds of extremes. It's either feast or famine. One of the things I love to ask them is fundraising a relationship or a transaction? And to Tushar, his answer is 100% clear. The capital follows the relationship, not the other way around. To Tushar, fundraising is almost entirely a trust game. And every single round he did has traced back to a relationship that he had been quietly tending for a long time. That has turned out to be an incredible secret to success. Okay, imagine that you are in a moment where your company has scaled a ton and you realize that you're in a problem. The market has turned. You have to cut 80% of the company. You've got to find a new path forward, and you're going to need to raise new capital to do it. Tushar's been through that, and it is super enlightening to hear how he did it. This conversation is basically a decade-long masterclass in what relationship fundraising actually looks like when things get really hard. I hope you enjoy it as much as I do. Here's Tushar. Hi, Tushar. Thanks so much for joining me. I'm really excited to have this conversation. You have been through so many twists and turns, and I love that you're up for sharing these. Everybody, when they meet a venture capitalist, has to introduce themselves and help a VC get to know them. How do you get to know a venture capitalist when you walk in the room? And maybe you can share a bit about your background and how you got here in that process.
No, thank you, Ben. Thanks for having me on the podcast. So I think every introduction has been really quite different, and it really comes down to just connecting and getting to know the folks. It's a long game, and investors are investing in companies and founders they believe in, and they're willing to be, on that ride for a decade, if you would, on an average. So I do believe that connection, authenticity, and the passion, I think all really matters. Maybe I'll just share the background of what did I do before Flyhomes and how did I jump into that. So I never thought I'll be in real estate. I went to do my computer science engineering, picked up a book on machine learning back in 2004, thought this is where the world is going to go, and ended up coming to Minnesota. I was doing brain research and AI research with Mayo Clinic, and then came to Microsoft, which is what got me to Seattle, and spent 6 years there. The fun roles I had there, one, I had a chance to be the PM for the main algorithm behind Bing.com, and we were competing with Google at scale, and that team was really a team of hustlers, and I really learned a lot. And then was chief of staff to the MD of India division for IT of Microsoft. Went back to do my MBA, was going to go to McKinsey, but that's when I met my co-founder, Steve. And best things in my life have happened when I actually take the detour and follow my heart. We were trying to start a company as a class project to save energy in every house. And then quickly realized that people don't upgrade energy in the houses because the capital investment doesn't get recouped in time, and housing market is opaque to the energy upgrade. So, it's like a nail with a hammer. I knew how to do machine learning and big data. So I said, okay, why don't I just make housing market be more transparent? And what if I rack the houses for discount for the road noise, the premium for the view, one layout versus the other layout? Would that then make a difference? So think of it like a Zillow++, like going detailed into data. I got the brokerage license just so that we can do fun things with the data. Steve, my co-founder, is a lawyer, and he was able to use his law degree to help us get the license. Even at that point, we had never imagined that I'll be doing real estate. My boss at Microsoft was going to buy a house. I'm like, oh, you're buying a house this weekend. We just got a license. Why don't we just help you buy one? And his question was like, do you know what you're doing? I'm like, no idea. We'll figure this out. And he just went for it. So over the weekend, I ended up helping him buy a home. So that's how I got into real estate. And then I thought I was taking a quarter off from my MBA. I thought, let me just help 10 families buy a home so I can understand what data is it that actually people care about. A lot of that was just like following my heart and then working with the customers as if you're working with yourself and understanding what the pain points were. But my desire was never to be a realtor. My desire was to actually solve customer problems. And fundamentally, what we found out as I got into this is people kept losing to cash buyers, perfectly qualified buyers, even though they were willing to pay more. And so we like, okay, how do we break that? And we were trying to come up with this idea of guaranteed offer. We will back our buyers with a guarantee and said, if you Flyhomes is representing the buyers, if they fail to buy the house, we'll step in and buy the house within a week or 2 weeks.
Yeah, I love that. A business that's founded in data that can guide you to a better decision for your customer is near and dear. All right, let's talk about kind of what's the arc been like for you and take us through it. Would love to get up to speed.
Yeah. So, 2016 is when we graduated, became a realtor on the fly. The idea was that we want to back the buyers with a guarantee, but we were still helping people buy and sell houses. We were actually not looking to meet investors. We were not looking to raise money. We were at 2 million bootstrap revenue run rate. We met a lot of great founders along the way. Actually, our first founder who invested and believed in us was Al Goldstein, who's actually also led our last round. And it's a really interesting story of how these journeys go super long. And he believed in us and he said, oh, I also have Mark Waydog, a friend of mine who is in Seattle. You guys should meet him. And then when we met Mark, we were like, Mark is awesome. Al is awesome. They want to invest in us. And it was literally a 30 minutes conversation. They wrote a very fair term sheet. But even with guaranteed offer, we would keep losing to cash offers when we knew that we were willing to pay more. So we said, well, why don't we just make everybody be a cash buyer? And that was a very radical idea. Like, we would literally front the cash, think of a credit card swipe for the biggest item that you would buy in your life, right? And to go do that. In order to go make that happen, we needed warehouse lines and balance sheet to support it. And 2 million plus 2 million was not going to be enough. In 2018, we ended up raising from Andreessen $16 million as a Series A at that time. Then from there on, we were having great momentum. But unfortunately, my co-founder got hit by a drunk driver on the side of the road. And Steve is okay now, just saw his family. He's doing great, starting another company. But this was an existential crisis of the company. One of the founders is in the hospital where we don't know how it's going to play out. And we had to raise a Series B because we were sort of growing into the curve. So we didn't have enough to keep scaling our business to get more access to the capital on the other end. So we weren't going to go out of business, but we couldn't offer a hero product, which was the cash offer around which we were building all the brand. So we had to sort of raise in during the duration while one founder is in the hospital. And this was a very, very difficult fundraise. And, I had my second daughter and she was also in the hospital in Seattle Children. So I'm literally sleeping in the hospital, visiting Steve in the hospital, and then flying to the Bay Area and trying to build the first two fundraisers they went very fast, almost too fast and too easy in some ways. So we hadn't built a big base of investors that knew us or anything like that. Investors look for is they're very in tune with the risk. As founders, you are the optimists. As investors, you have to sort of see what could go wrong. And one founder being in the hospital is a very unusual situation. We had to raise, but at that time, I had no idea if you would be able to raise in those circumstances or not. Remembered at least spending 2 months just knocking the doors, meeting a lot of people, sharing the stories. What's so interesting is that work that we didn't go waste. One of the investors at that point was super interested in investing in us, and they couldn't because they deemed one of their current investments as competitive to us. So when I was going for Series C, that company had then gone public and they had, sold their shares there. So I was able to actually ping them in the Series C process and they led the Series C round.
This is interesting, right? Those entrepreneurs look at fundraising as a transaction. They're not going to create a memorable connection. And if an investor's not a fit, they'll move on very quickly. They won't leave behind any threads to pull later. But I think it sounds like your orientation is, hey, if you're meeting somebody, you're going to invest in really meeting them. And should circumstances change, and people always say that in venture, hey, I'd love to invest in you at another opportunity. But you're one of those people who really keeps that thread alive because you invested in it in the first place.
Yeah, I think to your point, I've realized looking back that I really care about people that I meet. And that sort of builds the connection. And even if it's a no, You learn something from that experience, which is awesome. I do think that if you were fully present in that relationship, in that moment when you were there with them, that alone
Yeah.
is a pretty powerful experience. Like, so Series B, I almost needed a big brother at that time, because one of my founders is in the hospital, my daughter's in the hospital. I needed somebody that I can have an emotional connect with, that was willing to like just go out on a ski slope with me and have half a day just thinking about the company, not because we want to get the strategy right, but because we want to just get the headspace right.
I would say the average founder walks in acting like they're on Shark Tank, trying to give a good pitch, like very kind of playbook. And something tells me that you're in this very
Mhm.
vulnerable situation, and that must have been hard to navigate. How did you decide how much of that vulnerability to share when you were in this very, very intense situation as you're getting to meet investors? And what gives you the confidence to go more vulnerable?
The confidence comes from deep belief that you're going to make it happen. And what you're working on is actually like you believe in the mission, you believe it's going to be a successful business, it's going to be a good outcome. And you believe that even if you get a bunch of no's, all you need is one yes. When I was in India, for example, I was applying for internships in Europe to do research. You would write to 100 professors around the world, and all you needed was one or two professor to say, yes, I want to work with you and research with you. And that's all you need, right? So you don't have to be dogmatic about that, but you still have to have deep conviction that your idea is powerful and you personally want to go see that in the world and go build that. So that I think comes through even in those difficult moments. And I do think that most great investors understand that building a company is not a straight line. The world keeps changing, and you need people who are able to be resilient and adaptable in those situations. So I think in many ways, when the times was very tough, investors could go see it, right? I mean, and third is if people are not investing in you, I think for more often than not, people take it very personally. But I don't think that's what it is. You can always iterate and learn something from it, but their thesis could be different. I would fully respect if some investor is nervous about the fact that one of the founders is in the hospital and doesn't feel if time is right at the moment. I think that's their prerogative and choice. And I found that most good investors are also people who are very helpful. So even if they don't invest, they're willing to actually share something with you that you can learn at least a thing or two from that.
Do you feel like the vulnerability that you share with people, is that always an asset, or are there some people where it's actually a liability?
I think it can be liability at different junctions, but I would say for most part it's an asset. I do think everybody has the right to choose how much to share at what point. But I do think that the deep connection happens when you're willing to be sharing what didn't go well, what are the hardest things you're facing. And I found that to be a powerful thing, sharing both with your employees as well as externally. That day itself, he was in the hospital. We come back and I remember like my legs were shaking. I called all the team there. We were mostly in person and shared that this is what's happened right now and this is where we are. And I think builds a culture of resilience, not just in you as a founder, but the culture of resilience in the organization as a whole, which I think is also super powerful.
Let's fast forward. So you closed that Series B round and you move forward. How did you get to the Series C?
Yeah, so we closed the Series B round. We start hitting all the metrics that we said we're going to do, launching multiple markets. And then COVID comes, and initially that's very difficult for everybody. The whole world is upside down. We're all gone remote. And then the housing market, went on a frenzy after that. And it turned out to be a massive tailwind for us. So we looked at the benchmarks of where we were with revenue, what money would be needed for us to go to the different level. We wanted to go launch across the country at that point and also had multiple business lines now. And we were looking to sort of fund all of that together. So when we were thinking about raising a Series C, we were thinking of raising about $30 to $50 million. Mike Gafari, a Series B board member, was super helpful in helping us think through at that point who could be the investors, who could he introduce us to. So that's the other thing I found is like great investors will make either the right intros or people will come to them to learn more about the company. And their faith in the company reflects largely on, how your investment goes. And in one day, I had a pitch with Norvest and Battery Ventures, Roger Lee. And Roger had led the first round for Alex Lampel, who's from Andreessen. So again, a lot of the relationships matter there as well. And both Norvest and Battery liked us that day. And then we set out to raise $30 to $50 million and ended up raising $150 million.
From 30 to 50, how did it get to 150?
At that point, big checks were being written and competition was coming in. They were sort of, taking similar ideas that we had pioneered and scaling. So we wanted to be ahead of the competition and be the most well-financed in that category. So it was one of those things where we had great investors that we built a relationship with. They wanted to deploy capital. Competition was coming in. We had a really giant vision. And so when we found these great investors and they were willing to write a much bigger check, we like, okay, we can go do this. Honestly, at that point, we raised a little too much. We had about a monthly burn of $1 million. And then once we raised it, we presented a budget after that to have a burn for about $5 million to go nationally per month, right? And the fundamental assumption we had was we will be able to go raise more capital. And that's what the capital market was telling us. And that was a moment when we thought we were at the strongest. We had a budget. We said, we're going to spend 60 million launching a whole bunch of markets. We were at about 30, 40 million revenue run rate. The first half of the next year, we were already at 100 million revenue run rate and shooting for 200. So we were going super fast. And that was all correct, except that our burn rate had also gone up commensurately super fast. And then the market changed dramatically. And what happened was the customer acquisition cost, not in one day, but over the course of 1 to 3 years, went from essentially became 4x what it used to be. We could get the customers, but they weren't buying. And now our whole business direct to consumer is predicated on that. And all of a sudden, our fundamental business model is completely exposed.
Yeah.
And we are now burning, way more than what we'd even planned for just because revenue is not keeping up with it. I mean, that was a super hard battle for us for like 3 years after that. But to your question earlier, my point of view generally is ask for low, raise the right round that you can. But then after that, once you have managed to raise the successful round, I think it's really critical to pause for a little bit and breathe and say, hey, how do we think about our investments? And what happens if the things change dramatically? Which is what happened to us. We just hadn't modeled that kind of scenario enough. And what happens in that scenario is not only your revenues drop, your cost structure goes up, but also investor sentiment drops. There was no companies at that point, which are consumer companies in proptech that were going to get funded. And now you find yourself in a very difficult spot, which is like, how do we navigate this crisis, which is still on, like it's still a sustained high interest rate environment.
Did you get to the point where you felt like the cash in the bank we need to treat as potentially the only cash we have?
Yeah. And so having great investors around the board is super helpful. Our own investors who are, running awesome funds, they did give us clear guidance that you should assume that we can never fundraise again. This is the cash.
Yeah.
And I think as founders, I think it takes you a while to exactly hear that. And, I built a lot of trust with my investors, I built a lot of trust with the employees. And eventually we ended up having to cut, more than 80% of our company. And every time we made a cut, the market kept getting back to worse, but also the morale and the sentiment and the performance, everything sort of dips,
Like it is the hardest thing. And then sometimes those feel like they're cycling. And when you make cuts and the morale goes down, you worry about the business even more. And
right.
then that puts you in a position where the business does worse than expected instead
That's
of
right.
better. It's a tricky one to navigate. Having been through all that, if you had to advise other entrepreneurs who are going through a big change in their markets and have to make a big adaptation, what would you advise given everything you've been through?
Yeah, I think a lot of people in that space went out of business in that space because they were not willing to make super hard decisions or fast enough, in that direction. I think in general, we all tend to underreact because change is just hard, fundamentally hard. So I do think that, seeing the truth for what it is in that situation and also getting a lot of perspective. And for me, having great investors and great board around us was super helpful.
And that got you to your next round, right?
That's exactly right. So we still needed more cash. And the reason we needed more cash was back to why we needed cash in the first place. Our B2B motion started working really well. And we now needed more capital, warehouse capitals. And those partners wanted to see a stronger balance sheet. And they wanted to make sure that the current investors were also bought into the company, in that situation. But now we had a really difficult situation where we have a big pref stack and a really complicated cap table, and we need to go raise further cash. But for me, that's where you talk about trust and relationships. Our seed investor was the one who ended up helping us get that round going, Al Goldstein. And all but one were able to participate in the round, and everybody unanimously voted for getting the round done and helped be part of the round and put a company in a place that, we were able to get the fundraise done, get our capital lines in, and get back to growing in the distribution. And now we are profitable. And we've gone from a battle of survival to turning and controlling our own destiny from a capital markets perspective, and to start having a strong balance sheet from an equity standpoint. And would have not happened if we did not keep the trust, and the conviction that this is a massive category. We could build a massive business. And so that's been the journey. Essentially, it's going to be a decade this year of, being on this path. And my hope is that, I'm happy to take some years of just the upswing again and not having to deal with the existential crisis.
It's interesting. You're one of the few entrepreneurs who has been through the highs and then the low and can talk about that. Let me ask you a handful of questions. When you meet investors, what's your biggest green flag that makes you fond of an investor?
Yeah, I think it's a really great question. And I feel very fortunate that I've had such a great group of investors around us. So I felt like right from the very word go, I had people who had built incredible businesses themselves and were at the stage of life that they wanted to be a part of other founders' journeys and help them. And I think that came across very authentically. And then there was a connection that got established very quickly with those folks. So for instance, when we met Mark, he then introduced us to 4 or 5 investors for our Series A. And honestly, I liked all of them. They were all great people. They all were different. And we ended up choosing Alex Rampel from Andreessen, not just because it was Andreessen Horowitz, but also Alex is fantastic. He was a founder who had scaled at TrialPay and businesses before. He had been in their shoes, but also was really deep into fintech, proptech, and understood it from multiple different angles. So we ended up choosing actually the offer from Andreessen without that being the highest, because what I was looking for is somebody that I can learn from who could be a great partner on the board for many, many years. And somebody
Yeah.
who sort of brought that level of credibility to the capital markets, in that situation.
What about red flags? What are things that are big turnoffs for you when you meet potential
I
investors?
think one, I've been really fortunate that the way that our fundraising processes have gone, we have actually had a chance to meet really unbelievable investors who've had tremendous amount of experiences being part of great companies. And I do think that that exposure, both having built the company and connecting, really helps. I'm trying to think through what were some of the red flags. There have been situations where we didn't take the money because we didn't feel the founder connection. There was nothing wrong with the investor. Investor was great. But we just didn't feel the connection. A lot of that it's just your own personality. So it's not a red flag with the investor. It's the gap between how you see the world, or the flow is just not there. I think I would say for me, it's been more instinctive, actually.
A lot of times, one of the questions I like to ask is, do you look at fundraising as a relationship or a transaction?
Yeah.
I think I know your answer to that. Why not, why not look at it as a transaction? But clearly you're wired. You're wired for relationships.
Yeah, I think it's a really good insight, Ben, that you're drawing out. I think in my life, most things that I look at actually is from the relationship lens as a de facto. And if you're trying to build a long scale company, I think you go through such highs and lows. We had a pretty straight lines from seed funding to Series A, just up and up. But after that, the journey was not a straight line, and we had to go through several existential crises. And you need the right people. I mean, they're on the board with you. They're your partners. They're your thought leaders. You need their support. And it's just much more fun that way. I mean, at first, I think it's much more fun that way.
You've overperformed at raising capital in good markets where you took a 30 to $50 million round and more than tripled it. You've overperformed in really tough adverse situations. How does that matter? What would have happened if you weren't so good at this, if you didn't have the skills and the relationship orientation and the real draw with those people, with investors?
I mean, we've seen a lot of the companies ultimately not be able to survive that. Right? I feel really grateful that we've come through that. And I hope that this decade of strength is not just my resilience, but I think that gives the company the DNA of resilience. My hope is that we can build a generational company that keeps performing and navigating the changes that come our way.
I think about Blue Nile, which I was involved in as a co-founder, as you know. And at Blue Nile, we started with a cohort of 6 companies chasing us, all venture funded. And if you look at who made it through the narrowing point of the dot-com crash, really we were the one and only that survived and thrived. And I think you've got a similar story here, that you were the one who has made it through. When entrepreneurs ask you for advice based on all you've been through, what are the top couple of things that you share with entrepreneurs that you think make a difference to them?
Yeah, this is interesting. I would say like trust is your currency. Trust is the thing that compounds over many, many years, and it's too easy to lose that. So I think remain flexible, committed to your vision, and ensure that relationships are actually, as to your point, not transactional, but a long arc of building compounding trust.
Yeah. Amazing. That is super, super helpful and totally appreciate it, Tushar. Everything you've done with Fly Homes, you really have redefined that business and got it on a new trajectory for a new market, which is not easy to do at all. So cheers to you, man.
Thanks a lot, Ben. Appreciate it.
The line that stayed with me from my conversation with Tushar is when he said, trust is your currency. Not your deck, not your metrics, not how hot your category or your positioning is, all the things that founders obsess about, but trust built really slowly over years across every interaction with every single investor, whether they say yes or no. He was focused on trust building. His last round, that's where it really mattered. It was a totally brutal market. The company was completely restructured, and it wouldn't have gotten done if not for that kind of trust building. Ultimately, his seed investor he had met literally a decade earlier stepped up. And that was a case where his relationship compounded over 10 years, all to come through in a moment where it really mattered. Tushar builds trust by being super upfront, even in the company's most difficult moments. And that is not easy. Founders never know how to handle conveying the message when things are tough. But Tushar didn't try to spin those moments. He instead just kept showing up honestly. And what's really interesting is the trust that he built up by doing that. That was what made the difference when things got difficult. My huge thanks to Tushar for being so open about the full arc of his experience, the highs and the lows. Please follow us on Substack. And if you enjoyed this episode, a rating or review on YouTube or Spotify or Apple Podcasts would go a long way. And I'll see you next time on Razor's Edge.